I want to thank everybody for coming to our last IMPO Speaker Series for 2023. We are putting together or working on now our 2024 series. If you have any ideas, please see a staff member and let us know. For those of you that know or don't know, the IMPO is a regional planning organization founded in transportation planning. Essentially, when you fill up at the gas pump, you pay a federal gas tax. We get a portion of that back to the tune of about $60 million that we use for infrastructure projects around the region. As far north as Arcadia, Cicero area, as far south as Franklin, from Danville to Cumberland and Greenfield. So pretty big swath of area for us to fund projects. We also are doing other things that are of regional nature, including economic development, land use, housing, and water resource or environmental planning as well, as needed for the region. We are here today to listen to Dr. Steven Polzin. He is and holds his civil engineering degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's and a PhDs in civil engineering with focus on transportation from Northwestern University. He's currently a professor at Arizona State University School of Sustainable Engineering and Built Environment. His research interests cover a broad spectrum of transportation policy and analytics. His current research focuses on changes in travel behavior and the consequences of COVID on travel. Prior to his current position, he was the Director of Mobility and Policy Research at the Center for Urban and Transportation Research, and has worked at the transit agencies in Chicago, Cleveland, and Dallas. He's also served on the Transit Authority Board of Directors and the Board of Directors for an MPO. So he understands what it is we do. He has conducted a wide range of research for clients in all levels of government and in the private sector. So with that, I'm going to turn the mic over. Thank you so much for coming.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I thank you for taking your time. I'm going to cover a potpourri of issues today relating to what in the world's going on with transportation. I say that with glee because I've been in this business about 40 years and we're currently at the most interesting, most exciting, and most dynamic point in time for transportation that I've seen in my career. This is the general topic. These are the things I'm going to cover. I'll talk a little bit about kind of what I would consider something of a theory of travel and factors that influence. Then I'm going to spend some time going over some key trends. Most of the focus will be at the national level. I'll be glad to comment on some local issues as well to the extent I have appropriate background. And then I'm going to touch on some hot topics and take away, and we'll leave some time for questions. There's a lot of material in these slides. I'll go relatively fast. You won't be able to absorb it all, but I've made the PDF of it available, so if you want to take a look at it afterwards, fine. If you've got subsequent questions, don't hesitate to contact me as well. Certainly we'll take questions at the end, but if there's questions beyond that, certainly get in touch with me. Again, we're at really a really profoundly point of change for transportation. Arguably, it's the most significant set of changes since the advent of the automobile, and there's really a number of elements to it. Culture and values are changing at a pace that's a little different than has historically been the case for transportation and transportation decision making. The technology, I would argue, the single biggest factor of change that's dramatically influencing the choices and characteristics of transportation as well as its impacts. And finally, we're seeing some interesting demographic and culture changes that are influencing things as well. And we'll dwell on these a little bit. This is kind of a theory of travel. The fundamental drivers of growth in travel are growth in population, growth in income, and growth in knowledge. These lead to specialization in various activities that people participate in, including employment, consumption behaviors, social relationships, and time use. As people get richer, for example, they don't just settle for the local hamburger shop, they want to try the new French restaurant, etc. The employment roster of choices is dramatically different than it was 100 years ago, for example, and that, of course, generates more travel as well as more communication and more commerce. We purchase more more items, we're more specialized, we don't produce as much for ourselves, we in effect contract it out and purchase services and items and engage in the workforce ourselves. If you look at factors that influence behaviors associated with transportation, historically, a lot of transportation decision making had focused on those three yellow boxes on the top, the money cost, the time cost, and safety. Those were kind of the big drivers of transportation decision making, both at the individual level and even at the corporate and governmental level. Over time, we became a little wiser in terms of the consequences of travel and the externalities. We started paying attention to the environmental impacts. And over time, that expanded both in terms of the number and nature of environmental impacts, but we begin to appreciate the social impacts of transportation, the personal health consequences of transportation, etc. And we've come to understand that when people make transportation decisions, a host of other attributes are increasingly important to them: comfort, flexibility, reliability, image, and convenience, for example. And again, that influences personal decisions, decisions about an individual trip, but also decisions about where you want to live, what's its accessibility, what kind of vehicle or vehicles do you want to own or use. And at the corporate and governmental level, it influences choice decisions, location choice decisions, but also investment and policy decisions. Which modes are we going to invest in, which characteristics, etc. Technology is the big change item here. The most kind of recently appreciated attribute of that is the substitution of communication for travel. Basically, the flagship on that has been the dramatic change in telework participation. And while telework has gotten a lot of attention, it really is a lot more than that. It's e-health, it's e-commerce, it's watching worship services online, it's electronic banking where you virtually never need to go to a teller anymore, and that's really dramatically influencing travel and trip-making behaviors. Kind of associated with that and the presence of the web and the internet are the opportunities we have to, in effect, procure services and stuff through the web. If you don't want to paint the house and make 6 trips to the hardware and paint store, you can go on Angie and find the contractor and purchase that service, and increasingly people are doing those kinds of things. They're outsourcing what used to be their own travel to support activities and turning that over into a commercial activity. Other things that are in the queue are things like electrification and automation. I'll touch on those a little later, but a lot of nuanced characteristics: electronic payment systems, dynamic pricing of things like tolls. We're now seeing some innovative pricing strategies for transit fares, for example. We have trip planning and trip scheduling software capabilities, navigation. Guys no longer waste miles because they're lost and afraid to ask for directions. We can now ask Google. There's electronic hailing of vehicles, rideshare services, trip aggregating, matching, van pooling types of capabilities. There's instant customer feedback, so you can refine services and market characteristics to match customer needs. There's driver's assistance capabilities in vehicles, vehicle driver monitoring in a lot of commercial vehicles and fleets, hybrid vehicles, and vehicle connectivity. At a minimum, that means a lot of vehicles have access to the web, but ultimately that might mean being connected to the infrastructure, potentially other vehicles, as we move in the direction of further automation. In a generic sense, it enables these items on the right-hand side, the pricing strategies. Perhaps one of the more significant is the new business models, things like ride-hailing and some of these short-term car rental things you see where you can even have your own car as you go to the airport in some cities. You can make your car able to be used by other people while you're gone, etc. And we're seeing things like the scooter sharing, the e-bike sharing, etc. And we're seeing the new modes that are enabled by the ability to do that, connections through the internet for payment and geopositioning, scooters and e-bikes. We're also seeing very different environmental impacts enabled by the technology. Obviously, vehicles are much cleaner, and there's some stuff in the pipeline that will continue those trends on both the electric vehicle side as well as the internal combustion. Lots of customer features and amenities, comfort, safety, entertainment, etc. Not just in vehicles, but in services, Wi-Fi in trains and buses, etc. Comfort, convenience, those kinds of things. We're also seeing simultaneous with that a change in the kind of the stakeholders for transportation. The group has broadened out rather dramatically over time. I go to meetings now and you'll see venture capitalists show up and pay attention to things like automation and electrification. You'll see a lot of computer and logistics, computer engineering, electrical engineering folks are engaged in transportation as we've added so much technology. Strong environmental stakeholder interests in transportation as we've begun to appreciate more of the impacts and externalities of it. A lot of stakeholders related to social, political, and equity considerations, human factors issues, safety, etc., an appreciation of transportation's impact on public health. And that's really made a richer and more diverse, more multidisciplinary workforce. And simultaneously with that, the more cooks you have in the kitchen, sometimes it makes it harder to reach a decision, to reach a consensus. And because of some of the new attributes and issues that we're paying attention to, I would argue that it's getting more partisan than has historically been the case as well. Some key trends, this is just a one to add some perspective. About 69% of person miles of travel are household based, with the rest spread between domestic air, commercial vehicle, heavy vehicle, and about 1% total for rail and transit services. So obviously household vehicle travel's the big dog in this business. This is some graphs that I think historically will be fascinating simply because it shows the magnitude, the unprecedented magnitude of the COVID changes and the impacts of those shutdowns across all of the modes. This is person travel modes and how they were affected. I was very involved in this. I happened to be at USDOT when COVID hit, and we spent a lot of time trying to put together new metrics that were much quicker response and availability to support an understanding of the various federal agencies in terms of the impacts of COVID on economic activity and travel. You can see the bottom line here. The blue line is intercity bus. The line slightly above it is transit. Those modes that had shared potential exposure, risk exposure, were most severely impacted and recovered slower. And to some extent, the pronounced continuation of telework has impacted those as well. The freight side was really different. They didn't have so much the kind of the risk exposure issue, while there were certainly some driver exposure issues at the ends of trips, but we had a dramatic change in the economy where people that were not traveling to work anymore and weren't traveling on vacation and social activities were spending their money buying stuff. And so we had a surge in product consumption and a decline in service activity, travel, and consumption, and it created some logistics problems as well as some supply chain problems that the shutdowns created. So some pretty dramatic impacts in freight. This is a significant graphic. The top blue line is the national trend in total vehicles and miles of travel on the roadway system. This is all types of roads all across the country. You'll see the trend peaked in about 2007, flattened out during the recessionary period, recovered pretty strongly, started an upward trend up to 2019, plummeted with the COVID impact, has recovered some with some rebound travel in the 22 timeframe, what we call revenge travel or rebound travel, and then it's been tailoring off a little bit since then. Perhaps the more interesting line is the line below it. That's travel per capita. And you can see that peaked in about 2004, and it's not been that high since. And this is significant in the context of the future of transportation in the U.S. People have pretty much saturated their travel demand. It's been flat for a number of years. A number of characteristics, to some extent, the availability of autos has kind of reached a peak, and so folks have been stable at that. And we've been able to substitute communication for travel and telework and e-commerce, et cetera. Some demographic changes as well, but we're not looking at what we had looked at for about 50 years. If you go back from 1950 to about 2000, 2005, total VMT was growing at about 5% a year across the country. About 2% of that was population and 3% was travel per person. The travel per person went away, and the rate of population growth is dramatically lower than it was during that period as well. So we're in a period at the national level of much flatter demand. Here's some transit data. This happens to be monthly data. You can see the pronounced decline really got hit hard by COVID, including some disruptions in service in places. Has recovered, but not nearly to its pre-existing levels. We're still running in the 70 to 80% range in most places, a little better in small cities, not as well in some of the larger cities that have either strong telework markets and or crime and other things deterring transit use. This is a graph that has a couple messages. This is data from the census, and this is the normal mode for commuting to work. And a couple things that you can see, even without getting into the specifics, is that the trends were relatively flat and stable up until 2019. Things tend not to change dramatically in transportation, at least historically they don't. We did see some constant decline in carpool, shared ride commuting, and some upward growth in telework even before COVID. And then you'll see those two big blobs, two jumps there. Those are two different measures of telework, one based on the American Time Use Survey and one based on the American Community Survey that measures the usual mode. The Time Use Survey measures the actual mode on a reference day. The magnitude of those changes is profound. Just to give it perspective, the change in telework is greater than the total of car share, transit, bike, and walk before. So when you think of the impact on your transportation system, the dramatic increase in telework could be equivalent to more than doubling the sum of all those other modes, to give it some perspective on its significance. This is some additional data on telework. This is some survey work that comes out of Stanford that they've got both some census pulse survey data as well as a survey they administer. This measures full day at-home work commitments. And you can see, in spite of all of the media discussion, it's kind of stabilized in the 30-ish% range. Analysts debate the magnitude of that and the adequacy of the samples, et cetera, but it remains significant with the discussion. A couple months ago, this headline came out, and it made those folks that were kind of pining for things returning to the historic normal chuckle that the Zoom Corporation had ordered their folks to come back to the office a few days a week, recognizing the value of in-person participation in activities. Couple things that seem to be a consensus among the experts following this. We may still see some recovery in working in the office. We're learning more about productivity impacts over time, et cetera, and so we may see some return to work. But over the long term, we're likely to see growth in this. More and more of the jobs that exist are information jobs. The capabilities and technologies to support distance learning are distance telework are continuing to improve. If you went to the Consumer Electronics Show a couple years ago in the midst of COVID, everybody was showing off new technologies for everything from 3D holograph meeting sites to better technology for forecasting Zoom and integrating staff and measuring performance and productivity and building social relationships, et cetera. People are learning how to integrate telework into their workplace and how they can adjust it to fit their needs. So we see long-term growth. The pros, of course, are lots of happy employees, savings, opportunity for diverse workforce, facility savings, et cetera. There are lots of groups that really, really like telework. Introverts, moms working at home and the flexibility it gives them in time, folks with long and expensive commutes who have to pay for parking at the destinations, et cetera. People are saving a whole bunch of time and money through telework. Less new suits and ties, less trips to the beauty parlor, et cetera. And there's some strong constituency desires for that. The corporate structure is still scratching their head and trying to figure out how to both deal with it and its ultimate impacts on productivity, teamwork, mentoring, the ability to integrate new staff, et cetera, et cetera. But people can't, in the transportation profession, wait around thinking it's going to return to pre-COVID conditions. It's highly unlikely to. There seems to be a strong consensus across disciplines that we're on a path towards substantial telework activities going forward, and we can plan accordingly. This touches on some other characteristics. We reached during COVID record low levels of zero household cars. This year we were at, or in 2022 rather, 8.3% of households across the country didn't have a vehicle. That's about probably 6-ish% of the population, because they tend to be smaller households that are zero vehicle households. It's about 4% of population or households that have a worker in them have no cars. Some of these, of course, are folks that can't physically, financially, or otherwise drive a vehicle. Others are people who choose this because there's enough other choices, and Uber and Lyft and public transit and bike and walk, and they live in places where they don't need a vehicle and can rent one when they need one. And we've got, as you can see here, some very high levels of vehicle availability for other segments of the population, the 1, 2, and 3 vehicle levels. This is a hugely significant factor on the public transit side of things, as you can see. Average zero vehicle household made 227 trips on transit. One vehicle household made 40. A 2+ vehicle household made 11 in a year. So that gives you a sense of the significance of that in terms of understanding transit utilization. The mean travel time to work is the number that you quite frequently see stories about. every September, October, when the next set of annual data comes out, and you'll see lists of which cities congested and how much time's wasted in traffic. This is that census measure. The average commute is about 26.4 minutes one way right now across the country, and that doesn't average in the zero-time teleworkers. That's for folks that are commuting. You can see it did drop, and it remains below its prior peak. Historically, that number's been creeping up slowly over time, so its change with COVID is relatively significant. So the teleworkers themselves are saving probably an hour or more. Longer trips tend to be more high probability of teleworking, so those folks are saving some significant amount of time, and they're saving everybody else about 3 minutes a day round trips. So, so we can thank them for keeping off our roads if we have to commute during the rush hour. The two graphs here are simply to show two different scales. Depending on how you want to influence your audience, you can pick one or the other. It's the exact same data, so just scaled differently. This is zero worker households. When people think about transportation planning, oftentimes, you know, the work and the work trip is a historically dominant consideration, and yet we've got 27% of households don't have a worker in them. And remember, we had 20+% with teleworkers. So on any given day, about half the households don't have anybody commuting to and from work. Fairly significant number. And of course, those households then don't have the same sensitivity in their location decisions to congestion and proximity to workplaces, et cetera. They have a different set of considerations that influence their location choices. This is time and money spent on travel. In one graph, the yellow bars are the share of consumer expenditures. People have been spending a slightly declining share of household expenditures on travel over the past couple decades. It dropped from 2000 to 2010, and it's been relatively stable since then in terms of the share of household spending, right around 15%. Is the number 15–16%. The blue line is the time spent on travel. This is from the American Time Use Survey, another census product. And you'll see that's been ticking down too, which is a little bit consistent, or not little, it's consistent with this, this issue of declining per capita VMT. It bounced down dramatically during COVID. The red line means they didn't have a very robust sample and missed collecting data 3 months during COVID. So it's flagged as differentiated, but it hasn't recovered to the number that pre-existed in terms of time spent traveling. But this has not gotten, transportation has not gotten more burdensome on households over the past couple decades. This is the specifics of consumer expenditure. The top blue line there is transportation costs, the green line vehicle purchases, the yellow line public transit, and the brown line gasoline and other things. So it has ticked up during the COVID recovery with inflation, and obviously some pretty steep increases in vehicle purchase costs that registers in that as well, as scarcity and stuff during the COVID period resulted in you were buying at MSRP plus as opposed to MSRP minus for new vehicles during that time period. This is e-commerce data. This is the share of economic activity measured in dollars that's carried out online. And you can see it had been an upward sloping graph pre-COVID. It bounced up pretty dramatically. It's softened considerably, but it's kind of reverted to its old upward slope. Nobody knows where that ends, but obviously it's significant, both in the potential to reduce person travel, but increase commercial travel on the other side of the equation. About 15.4% of economic activity in that area. A point to add to this is that household travel constitutes about 70% of the volumes that we see on our roads in general. Heavy vehicle travel is about a 9 or 10%. And that other 20% is commercial activity and personal travel, but associated with your work, i.e. if you're a realtor and you're showing 20 properties a day, that's not, you don't typically put that in your household travel survey. Or if you're an estimator going around giving people prices for what's that, leaf guard and solar panels and new windows and those kinds of things. Those folks are putting lots of miles on cars, and that also includes all of the police, fire, school bus, emergency vehicles, trash pickup, et cetera, et cetera. That's about 20%, so that's a big number. And they're heavy vehicles, they're more impactful environmentally, they use more energy, and for the most part, they're not conducive to switching modes. You don't get those folks to hauling samples around to take the bus or ride the bike. So it's an interesting segment that, in my opinion, the planning community has underappreciated the significance of it. This is some federal data that came out this spring. Their long-range forecast for VMT trends. The top line is light-duty vehicles, that's predominantly personal vehicles. And you can see they're looking at much more moderate rates of growth. And that's really driven by population growth for the most part. We're looking at much slower population growth. Obviously, that'll be impacted by what we ultimately resolve to be domestic immigration policy. That could be bigger if we choose to divert from historic norms in terms of immigration. But otherwise, natural growth is basically flat, and what growth is expected is generally immigrant population. As typical, commerce activities, truck and other things are expected to grow faster than that. We've spent less time as a profession understanding that. I personally think that's a little rich. I think it'll track closer to population growth ultimately, but this is what the feds are using right now. When we think about adding and building infrastructure, there's lots of reasons we do it beyond growth. And if you look down this list, maintenance and renovation, safety, resilience, impact mitigation, sound walls, et cetera, technology upgrades, and growth in demand, and redistribution of demand. And that's kind of important to think about. I mean, one could argue that, well, if we're not going to grow, we don't need to add capacity to the transportation system. But we do if we move people around from places where they were to someplace else. I use the example here of Florida. In 2022, Florida had 65,000 people coming just from New York State, turning in their driver's licenses in Florida and getting a Florida driver's license. And just for fun, I calculated, well, that's a lot of new demand, and how many lane miles are there per capita? Well, nationally, there's 133 feet of lane mile per capita, so you multiply that out, and those folks from New York owe us 1,600 lane miles of roads and probably a few buses and train cars as well. But that same concept of redistribution of demand works if people move from an urban core to a fringe. There is a capacity need there, and there may be some existing infrastructure that's now underutilized, or perhaps just less congested and appropriately utilized, depending on the context. But those are the things that influence demand. On the freight side, there's a host of things that we're still learning more about. There's a lot of talk of onshoring of manufacturing. If we do that significantly, it will add to freight traffic. As we offshored production and of products and purchased them from China and other places, not only did we get the products from there, but all of the transportation that was part of that development was handled offshore as well. If we bring the manufacturing back, we'll ultimately bring back some transportation demand. We're looking at some change in diversification of supply chains. For example, the shift of the Panama Canal shifted some supply chains across the country, so you can see some things there. Other industries are looking at more diversified sourcing, just to give them some resilience. And so that could change some patterns and some infrastructure demands associated with commerce as well. The e-commerce is another factor that people are learning more about. If you've got an Amazon truck that's following a route and delivering 400 or 500 packages, it tends to be relatively efficient. But if you're getting stuff delivered in a 2-hour time window where you're giving a lot of miles per drop-off, that's real different in terms of the transportation demand that's created. So there's some policy and pricing elements that will influence the amount of commercial traffic that's generated as we continue to do more things on site. This is some data on population redistribution. At the national level, we've had a history of movement from the Midwest and the Northeast to the South and the West. That's moderating in some of the more recent data. California has lost population the last 3 years in a row, for example, where historically it's been one of the fastest growing areas. The South remains a strong destination for population. There's still places shedding population in the Midwest and the Northeast. It is selective, but New York continues to be losing significant shares of population, and some other places as well. There's other folks that pay attention to where is it going, is it urban or suburban? And we've had kind of a renaissance of condos in central business districts that had strengthened some urban growth trends. We seem to be shifting back to something of a suburban focused growth pattern, and certainly telework facilitates that. The dynamics are intriguing. This is a map of population shifts just over the past 2 years, 2000 through 2022, and the yellow places lost over 2,000 counties, lost over 2,000 people, and the dark red ones gained over 2,000, or the dark blue ones rather, gained over 2,000. You can see which areas are growing and which areas are shrinking, and that, of course, influences ultimately travel demand as well. I'm going to shift to some hot topics here. Funding is always a priority topic for public, or for transportation in general, certainly for public transportation. And there's a host of issues associated with the federal role that are percolating. The infrastructure bill passed now a couple years ago is a 5-year cycle of funding, but that 5 years isn't that far or that long. There's already folks, the lobbying community and others, that are starting to talk about, what about the next one? What about the next one? And so folks are paying attention to that. And they're specifically looking at it in the context of this graph here. This is federal dollars. The red line is demand for federal spending, or a forecast from the Congressional Budget Office of federal spending. The blue lines are the Highway Trust Fund. That's the funded part that comes from the fuel taxes. About 85% is that fund comes from the fuel taxes. The other 15% from miscellaneous taxes on tires and heavy trucks and other things. The green bars are the plugs from the general fund. And the last time transportation was authorized, there was a huge slug of money coming out of the general fund, inclusive of the COVID responses and the new legislation that hit fiscal year 2022's budget. It won't all be spent in fiscal year 2022. That will cover the duration of the 5-year funding cycle, but it paints the picture that a couple years from now we're going to have a significant challenge where the existing revenue stream is in the neighborhood of half what we need to sustain the historic federal role in funding transportation. So when you think of that half what we need in the context of a gas tax. You'd need to double the 18.5-cent gallonage tax, maybe a little more, because with electrification and hybridization, we're getting less revenue out of that, less mileage, gallonage consumed. And this has got people thinking about things like mileage-based fees for funding transportation, supplemental fees on electric vehicles that aren't buying gas, et cetera. But a huge challenge that's ahead of us, which creates some uncertainty. And that uncertainty then is going to translate into, well, what should be the role of the federal government versus state and local, et cetera, amongst those things. This is some data on spending priorities. I stuck this slide in. Steven sent me the survey results from the local survey that was done here about community spending priorities. And interestingly, about 20 minutes before he sent me that, I'd been reading a new report that just came out this month that's a national survey of attitudes towards transportation spending. And interestingly, this is very similar to the results in your survey. Obviously, they weren't identical questions, et cetera. Some slightly different categories, but a fairly consistent set of attitudes regarding what are public priorities in terms of future investment. I want to touch on climate stuff a little bit and put it in perspective. Needless to say, it's got a huge amount of attention lately with the reauthorization and the current administration. Just for perspective, the U.S. is currently, as of 2022 or 2021, I believe, was at 13.5% of global emissions. Now, that's not the cumulative consequence of the U.S., but that's the estimate of what share of total emissions are produced in the U.S. Of the global total. And that has some implications that I'll mention here in a second. Across the sectors of the economy, transportation is the single biggest. It's the 29%, 28.6%. That's all forms of transportation, surface vehicles, marine, airlines, pipeline, pumping, et cetera, and electrical generation, industrial, and then a smattering of others across the spectrum there. So we're 13.5, we're 29% of 13%, and then you start moving into modes and categories and geographies and everything to get a sense of the impact. On the right-hand side of this graph is the categories of vehicles and their consequence. Personal vehicles are significant at 40% of the transportation emissions. Heavy-duty and medium-duty trucks are 23.5%, light-duty trucks 17.5%, et cetera. And then the smaller categories are some of those other modes. And folks are looking at, what do we do to each of these and what's its ultimate contribution? And that's really part of the challenge. One of the messages that at least to me is that what we do has to not only make a contribution itself, but we have an opportunity to put in place technologies and tactics and strategies that can be models for other locations, because there's no way we can solve this problem ourselves. If we went to zero tomorrow, that would back up global emissions about 7 or 8 years in terms of the magnitude of U.S. contributions. So unless collectively we and others find the technologies that are acceptable and affordable in a broader swath of the world, that may not have the same political will or resources that America does, we're not going to be particularly meaningful in terms of our significance. So there's a certain amount of technology and role modeling that are going to be necessary there. I want to touch on electrification as well. We're currently about 3 million electric vehicles in the fleet, about 1 million sold in the past 12 months, about 7% of current sales, and that's just a few months old, so it was pretty indicative of what was going on then. And a couple cartoonish pictures on the right. That top picture, all those parked cars there are electric vehicles in China, where several of the ride-hailing companies had bought electric fleets and went out of business. And those vehicles were spec'd with ranges of about 80 kilometers, and they were in effect technologically obsolete. So they were 2- and 3-year-old cars that are in effect a stranded asset because they're obsolete. And the bottom one is electric car food. The point being that unless we move towards sustainably generated electricity, just electrification, while electrification in and of itself can provide some efficiencies, to really leverage that, you need to have the generation capacity moving to sustainable conditions as well. There's a huge issue of balancing generation, transmission, charging, and then vehicle sales. And there's frankly not enough attention to that, and we're already starting to see some of the challenges associated with that. The other thing is it's gotten political in the sense of each administration. The last 3 cycles have changed the prior administration's CAFE standards, and that creates uncertainty and lack of inertia. If we had Congress doing those as opposed to the executive, we'd have much more likelihood of those being both more perhaps practical, but also sustainable and accomplishable. So there's some real risks. There's risks of stranding assets. We're in a period of very rapid change right now in terms of vehicles. We've seen a lot of that just in the last few months. This is a quote from Bill Ford, the executive at Ford Motor Company. Electric vehicles are being politicized like the vaccine. It's kind of scary to think transportation decisions are going that way. On the right-hand side is a bunch of narrative about how companies are rethinking and changing what they're doing on the electric vehicle side in light of some slowdown in that market. Tesla's missed sales the last 2 quarters targets. They've slowed down some of their production and their planned production as well. A number of other manufacturers have as well. Of the top 10 longest lived cars on a used car lot, 3 of those are electric models, 2 Teslas and the Mach-E. The inventory of electric vehicles has kind of creeped up where it's higher than ICE vehicles right now. So there's some adjustment and some uncertainty. There's some people waiting to see what the next generation looks like. So there's some things going on there that'll be kind of interesting. On the autonomy side, we're plugging along, not at the pace that originally was expected. When folks first started talking about this seriously 10 years ago, there is some headway, but it's going to be a little bit a rocky road forward. I've ridden in the autonomous vehicles in Phoenix. It's neat, it's fun, it's fascinating, but it's a lot yet to learn, and the pace of rollout remains to be seen. I want to touch a little bit on induced demand. There was some interest in this. I'll be fairly quick here, and if folks want to talk more in detail later, we can do that. It is real. If you reduce the price of something in time or money, people consume more of it. It's basic economic theory. But oftentimes it too has become politicized. It's not necessarily just the difference between the before and after traffic, the before and after traffic for a new facility, because we often have redistributed land use and activity patterns. In fact, sometimes that's the purpose of facilities. We want to have economic development. We want land use to redistribute. So yes, you're going to get more demand. You see shifts in travel paths to take care of to take advantage of new capacity. You see temporal redistributions. Somebody that didn't want to drive during the rush hour and avoided it now is back into the rush hour because that works better for them, because there's capacity. You do see some shifts in mode. But there's a lot less of that than there used to be because there's not a whole lot left to shift. The mode uses for non-personal vehicle are so modest that there's not big numbers to move there. But you do see some real new trips and longer trips that take advantage of that saved time. The empirical data on induced demand tends to be 20 and 30 years old. So it's not reflective of kind of the post-communication era, the post-stabilization in personal travel, the post-saturation of vehicle ownership, and frankly needs to be updated. And there's work that's taking place at the federal level to look at that. There's a number of groups that are trying to dig into this because it's gotten to be such an important topic. And it's not exclusive to roadway. Anything we do to reduce capacity on a road induces travel. And that means if we do a great job of travel demand management, we free up some capacity in the road and somebody's going to take advantage of it. Or if we do a great job of integrating transit or implementing transit and free up roadway capacity, that means somebody's going to take advantage of it. And so it's not exclusive to road investments. There's a lot of things that there's value of induced demand, residents having more choices and businesses having better selection and lower prices. Historically, transportation planning has been motivated by providing mobility and the economic and social opportunities that come with that. We perceive that to be a value. Yes, there's costs and consequences, but that continues to have a value, and to the extent that we can let people perhaps get to a store that has better selection and lower costs, or find a job that better leverages their skills and opportunities, that's a positive in personal utility. Same thing on the business side. If it gives them a better labor pool, a better market, better supplier base, etc. And making supply chains obviously helps. Getting emergency vehicles where they need to go in time isn't bad. Pulling cut-through traffic out of neighborhoods isn't bad. Having less congested paths so they're more direct isn't bad. Lots of positives associated with mobility, and those still exist, so we need to weigh the benefits and the consequences when we make decisions. This is just a throwaway slide. I don't talk about equity. It's a huge issue in transportation. I know that. We could spend hours on that alone. I've got the perfect solution for equity, though. The only way you're truly going to have transportation equity is if you have teleportation where everybody's got one. There's no cost, no consequences, no time or money costs, no externalities, etc. Then we'll have perfect equity. Anything short of that, we're going to have squabbles about it, and we'll leave it at that. So couple of takeaways here. We're in an era with much greater uncertainty than in the past. Much more rapid rate of change, much more complex, contentious decision criteria, more political partisan decision making with more stakeholders, meaningful opportunities for technology to make positive contributions. In some ways, I get frustrated that we put the burden on the engineers to solve our problems because we don't have the political will to do it otherwise. But they've done a lot for safety and some other aspects of transportation, emissions, et cetera, and hopefully can continue to do more. Certainly some opportunities for innovation and great fun for policy wonks, because it's just a fascinating time in this business. I would suggest things like focusing on adaptable solutions, building stuff rigidly based on presumptions of what the future is going to be like are at risk. Building things that are adaptable or flexible and can offer value immediately and aren't dependent on some future material or some future conditions materializing, give you the best course forward. and we need to be able to discern the differences between aspirations and fantasies. There's a lot of wishful thinking about the future that simply doesn't pencil out in terms of common sense and affordability and some other aspects. And with that, I'll back off and revert to some questions.
That's fantastic. I'm Steven Stansbury. I want to thank you all again for coming tonight. I feel like I should get a college credit. That was a lot of information. I know I learned a lot. I ended up taking copious notes, and I had about 1,000 questions, but I'd rather leave some of the time for you all to ask your questions as well. In the interest of time, I want to manage it as best possible. We probably need to be out of here by 1:15. Just be mindful of that. So I'm going to give a demonstration question. The shorter the question, the more we can get in, obviously, and the more equitable it will be. And with that, I can think of no better person to maybe ask the question. This region is planning for the future right now. Their plans looking out to the horizon year of 2050. None of us has a crystal ball, but you certainly possess a lot of knowledge in your brain about trends. A lot of them are really positive. Some of them are not so positive and they're uncertain. I'm just really curious about the VMT number. So all those graphs that we saw, the vehicle miles traveled, they ended at 2022. That's historic data. If you had to project out, if you had to guess, are we going to plateau based on those travel trends? Are we going to increase and go back maybe to our old ways of doing things? Or we're going to start seeing a decrease in VMT over time?
I think we're going to probably be close to a plateau, qualified by depending what happens with immigration. I think per capita travel is going to be flat to slightly down. Because there's just so many other ways to carry out activities now. I think there's a lot of pressure on resources that means, you know, if the country gets real rich on a personal basis, you know, money begets travel, but we've got enough accumulated deficits that I think that the opportunities for us to get real rich and be able to superfluously travel are limited. I'm guessing with a pretty flat. In fact, I'd written some forecasts for FHWA in about 05 where I was talking about flattening and everybody thought I was nuts because we were coming off 5% trends. I think we'll stay at a flat rate going forward.
You get insider trading happening right now. I also want to be respectful. Someone took the time to send us a question in advance, so I want to be sure we get that at the top of the list. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, so I hope I represent it accurately. In light of the fact that most federally funded projects have what's referred to as a purpose and need, there's got to be a logical purpose and need associated with that, and you're familiar with that process. There's some attribute information associated with how much travel demand maybe a particular project is addressing. And curious, based on the trends that we're seeing in the post-COVID era, is there a need for us to modernize our project selection process or the criteria that we use to select projects at the federal or even the local level?
I think there is, and I think adaptability and flexibility and to some extent robustness of the solution. There's a couple things folks are doing. A lot of people are doing, you know, let's do 5 scenarios of the future and which is the best, which project performs the best irrespective of what scenario materialized. So that's one tactic and strategy for kind of testing. The other one is to look at, in effect, when the value of a project can be realized. And the sooner you can capture the value and the benefit of that, the more you can, in effect, amortize it before a future perhaps changes where its value is no longer as relevant. There are some things in terms of adaptability and flexibility as well that, for example, if you own a piece of pavement, you can use that in all kinds of different ways. In the future, you may have managed lanes, you may have truck lanes, you may have automatic vehicle lanes, individually priced lanes, exclusive lanes for electric vehicles, exclusive lanes for transit. So you can manage that to get the most out of that asset. I tend to like investments where you put the technology the investment in the technology and the policy, and you keep the infrastructure relatively simple and leverage it, and that can be different over different times. And you'll see that in some places where the reversible lanes and et cetera, that can accommodate different futures.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the audience now. See a question in the back.
Transportation funding at the federal level, like some other federal programs, but specifically on transportation, hasn't substantially changed in the past 30, 40, 60 years. That 18.6 cents per gallon was set in the 90s.
93.
And has not increased. Yet the cost of everything, the number of miles of everything that we have has increased tremendously. And so maintenance becomes a concern, but also just providing choices and capacity is really hard with limited funding availability. Do you see movement in thought at the federal policy level? Because there's barriers at the state and local level, but there's little capacity for change there when there's not fundamental change in the way we think about funding transportation at the federal level.
There's about 6 different attributes of that question. I think the reality of that challenge will come up at the next reauthorization cycle. And because the gap is so big and we appear to be gaining some sensitivity to the deficit and the debt and the sustainability of that. So all of a sudden those two could clash. And we could see a push to rethink the federal role in terms of funding. There is suggestions in the legislation and requirements for a mileage-based vehicle fee pilot studies at the federal level. There's been a number of those done at state and regional levels. There's movement towards that because it's inherently more equitable with alternative fuel sources, et cetera. There's a dilemma with that. I mean, there's some downsides of confidentiality and et cetera, that folks raise. But to push both a new method and more money at the same time is a big political hurdle. And it was interesting in the price spikes recently in fuel, the past couple of years, several governors, walked away from their gas tax. I believe it's Nikki Haley said we should get rid of the gas tax. And some folks have relaxed it. Because of the kind of the political influence of a gas tax, there's been reluctance to raise it at the federal level. In the reality, something like 27 states have raised it, some multiple times, and without significant political pushback. They tend to do that with a very disciplined, targeted spending plan so that the voters have confidence that they're in fact getting what they want with that. In Europe, for example, they fund transportation with general funds, but they have huge taxes on fuel that fund the general fund. So and they overfund, they underfund transportation relative to what they collect to capture externalities, et cetera. I don't know where we're going to head on that. There are folks that advocate, the federal role was to build the interconnected interstate system. We need to maintain and sustain that, but we need to back off all of the other stuff that we're trying to do and let the locals do that if they want to. And it's, bike, ped, transit, et cetera. Those can be, quote, local issues. Now, not everybody shares that perspective, obviously, but there's certainly that camp that argues that federal resources, the federal role should be redefined in a more modest sense and let the communities who presumably know what's best decide how they want to fund things going forward. So it's an open question, and we've kicked the can down the road for quite a while here. It's getting to be a pretty big can to kick, so we'll see if reality soaks in here or not.
Other questions?
I guess I'll do one.
Sure.
Just interested in your thoughts on sort of new technologies that are emerging. Twofold. First of all, technologies for tracking and sort of analyzing how people are traveling, like tracking Bluetooth data or the way people are using different means of transport. And I'm curious if there's any that you find really interesting and illuminating. And then on the sort of use side of individuals, the way people are using real-time maps in Google Maps or reports of when buses are arriving, Do you think that the developments in in technology are going to significantly change the way people travel, or do you see travel as driven by other more mundane sort of concrete trends?
I think it is changing some things. It's certainly changing planning. People are using new data sources, cell phone data in particular, and there's enough penetration of cell phones now that you can get closer to an unbiased sample by doing that. There's still problems with it in terms of vetting it and making sure it's accurate. We've historically relied on census data just to be the gold standard, and that's harder to get, and people don't want to do surveys anymore. So that's a big challenge. So that kind of data is helpful. It was very helpful in COVID. We purchased through Department of Energy some real-time, almost real-time data where we were getting stuff every week on VMT data. You get it real fresh and processed quickly and turn quickly, and it's useful to monitor things like that. So I think it is, and I do think that the technology is influencing travel and travel paths. I mean, you'll hear people complain about, local traffic on the street when the freeway's connected because they're all following the Waze, directions to go through the neighborhood, and they don't like it. And so that means people are paying attention to that data and using it. So yeah, I think it's a real asset. I think it is helpful. And little things like before you go to, even if you're going to go to the store to buy something, people check and see if it's in inventory and check the price at 2 or 3 places and then go to the one that has it. And so I think it's influencing travel in lots of ways and generally very positively.
So I thought the recovery by, not necessarily mode, but by transportation typology was very interesting in that Amtrak has gotten back up to pretty much 2019 levels. Driving is back up to 2019 levels, but transit and intercity buses remain stubbornly low, and part of that is because transit agencies are still way below their service delivery from 2019, and that kind of goes.
That's not. It's the telework.
It's the telework.
It's a combination of telework and urban crime. Frankly, I mean, there's several big cities. New York's 40% of the transit in the country, and LA's in the top 10. All the big, the top 10 cities are about 80% of transit use in the U.S., and several of those have real serious crime problems. Where one of my favorite headlines was a study out of San Francisco, a headline: Blue ribbon panel finds feces, drug paraphernalia, and urine smells deters riders. I'm like, they needed a blue ribbon panel to figure that out, really? And that's a chronic problem in some cities, and it scares people, and they don't want to use transit. And telework is huge in some of those cities. Those are the cities with the 90-minute and 2-hour commutes, and if you can work at home, that's a big time and money savings to somebody to do it. And there is good data. There's high variation in what's going on in the different cities, depending on the culture and the character and the commute lengths and some of those characteristics. And there's pretty good data available on that. I shared some with the staff on some of the stuff that's going on.
I wonder if maybe following up on the transit, just real quick, you had a slide up earlier that was talking about induced demand. I forget the phrase you used exactly, but to summarize, anytime that we either make something free or we increase the affordability of it, its consumption goes up. I'm curious, as it relates to transit, there's at least 24 cities in the U.S. right now that are offering fare-free transit with mixed results. Do you feel like induced demand, that principle applies to transit as well?
To some extent it does, and I think you're seeing some success on the free fares and some success on the fare capping. There's kind of mixed policy perspectives on that. I mean, when people say, oh, we need to subsidize transit fares, well, transit fares are subsidized 85% already. So I mean, it's a steal in any way, shape, or form relative to the cost of providing the service. But there's certainly, some arguments for some segments of the population the capping fares and/or free fares can benefit them and that they'll travel more. There's nuisance issues of homeless people get on the bus because it's air conditioned and it's free, so they ride all day, and there's some weird things like that. There's kids will hang out on the bus, and so you can get some induced demand that has no particular social or economic value, and actually can scare away some other riders. So you get some mixed things going on there.
We've got time for one more question. Who's got the best one?
I want to ask you about the trade-offs between the reduction in kind of individual commercial trips and how that has shaken out with the increase in like micro freight, retail, direct to home.
People are still learning about the kind of the net on that. Like I said, I think if you've got something where it's scaled up like a FedEx or an Amazon, those are relatively efficient because you're delivering hundreds of packages and the route has lots of stops, so you're getting very few miles per stop. It's the ones that concern me from a policy perspective are the 2-hour windows for deliveries and the just-in-time meals and some of those things where you get a whole trip both directions for 1 or 2 deliveries. Those could be burdensome. And right now, as we did with a lot of things, it's underpriced now. The true cost of doing that isn't being paid by the user because everybody's trying to compete and build market share, etc. At some point, just like we've seen Uber and Lyft fares go way up in the last couple of years, the market reality catches up and you'll see a different market response, and there may be a cost consequence. But if you want it in 2 hours, you're going to pay a premium for it, and that'll moderate the demand.
I have a very important announcement. At Key Park, I have vouchers, so happy to share those with you. But with that, I do want to thank you for your time, both you in attendance today. Some great questions, and I appreciate your support for the speaker series in general. Hope you continue to monitor the progress of the plan. Really value the participation. And Dr. Polzin, thank you for sharing your time and your expertise with us.
It's always fun. I can talk for hours on this stuff.